So thank you for joining us for our panel, The Future of Procurement, Innovation, Agility and Impact. I'm Sophie Moule. I'm the Director of Marketing and Product at Bloom Procurement Services. And if you attended this morning's sessions, hopefully you will have already had some great insight around how procurement can be an enabler for change rather than a barrier. So the panel now is building on these insights to focus on some practical solutions of how we can do things better and differently. So I'll reintroduce our speakers now. So thank you very much to Danielle Aberg for joining us, Head of Social Value and Consulting at Thrive, Richard Dickinson, founder of Social Value, Quality Mark and Social Founder Business, and also Steve Mason, who is the founder of Scope Zero UK and Unitary Counsellor, and finally Matt Hunter, co-CEO and co-founder of Plus X Innovation. So please join me on the stage.
Side positions.
Thank you. So we obviously had a lot of insight this morning, but there wasn't a huge amount of time for Q&A. So this is a real opportunity for Q&A from the audience, but also with each other. And I think we can get some really good discussions going. I know that especially the social value conglomerate kind of didn't have a lunchtime and just carried on speaking after the panel session. So I hope we can get some really good insights today. So I'm going to start off with a question that I know is going to drive some conversation. So with everything going on in the world today, are we finding that social value is being put on the back burner, and is there some tension there around prioritization of what's most important? And I'm going to jump to Steve first for that one.
So it's interesting. I was at a session last night with Friends of the Earth and MedAct and the Climate Change Committee. And I asked exactly that question. And my question was, in the current state of politics, and net zero is my thing, is net zero becoming, and climate change going on the back burner? Mm-hmm. And I generally think it is in some sectors. And I think the confidence is being undermined quite a lot in that sector at the moment by the political narrative. And I do think we need to change that quite considerably. Mm-hmm. Social value, maybe not as much. We can argue that with community and localism. Is that a word I want to use? I'm not sure. But I think, yes, I do think it is.
Okay. And I'm actually going to jump to Matt now, because something we've spoken about is that, you know, the struggle for prioritization around what's most important at the moment. Because I think if I was sat in a procurement team at the moment, you're being challenged to do so much and to think about so many different things. So obviously value for money, outcomes, social value, sustainability. I mean, what's some advice you've got around, you know, the kind of prioritization of that and how that can be handled?
Yeah, well, the clue is in the word, I think, prioritization. I mean, as I understand it, prioritization is about having an order for things and saying this matters more than that. And I think what's very difficult, especially when you're trying to satisfy so many people, is to tell the truth, or to have clarity on what unfortunately matters more than something else. And I thought Danielle made a really interesting point earlier on about, well, it depends on the context. Maybe it shifts, maybe the priorities shift a little bit about how I might execute something around social value or sustainability. So the problem is, I think, that literally sticking a checklist of everything and expecting everything to be a priority and not having any sort of nuance and adaptability, just looking from the outside, not being an expert in this particular sort of space, it's a recipe for disaster. So yeah, the question is, how do you really say, I'm sorry, but this matters more than this, perhaps in this particular context? There's got to be some form of flexibility, I think.
Can I jump in there as well, just in terms of, you know, the prioritization is absolutely key. You know, we can't do everything, otherwise, actually, we do it all very shallowly rather than having any depth in terms of that kind of delivery, the output, productivity, innovation, etc. I think what is the biggest challenge at the moment is that short-termism, is the fact that we're looking what is right in front of us now. You know, we need to be able to better equip our commissioners to understand, if we do this now, what is that longer-term impact in that prioritization? So the prioritization shouldn't just be what is commercially viable now, what have we got capacity for now. It should be starting with what do we want to achieve in 5 years, and actually making the decisions from that standpoint.
And do you think there is a prioritisation framework that could be used for something like that could be standardised across kind of local and central government, or are the challenges different?
We were just talking about that, weren't we? We were just talking about, and actually Steve is probably a great one to comment on that in terms of having a framework that allows, that is standardised to a certain degree and has that interoperability to allow, central government bodies, local authorities to all kind of follow the same process to understand not only their local area, that applies in some senses, but in others it's about, it might be an industry or a sector or such. But having that standardised approach that is not overcomplicated, that potentially does include, because, we were talking about value and how do we share value, and that's where monetisation actually is quite important, but it's about the context in which it's used, so the monetisation initially was designed to help local authorities develop business cases. So it goes back to that, they're already as a framework there. I think it's more about how do we refine that framework to make it more easily accessible and able to be rolled out quite easily across those teams.
Sorry, just jump in there actually. All the time we make it contract specific, we won't get systemic change because we need to lift the conversation up. And it goes back to the conversation we were having over some lunch is ultimately if we make it a organisational wide context, priorities, based on factual community need, values, engagement, it won't keep changing and you will not then procure in isolation. Going back to what we were saying is you procure something within social care but there's a health benefit. Whose value is it? Who pays for it? Who benefits from it? Who cares?
Yeah.
It's interesting. So we mentioned frameworks and as a politician, we're looking to find the best ways of monitoring the progress of that organisation. So we introduced the Sustainable Development Goals into North Yorkshire Council, and they accepted it, and they said, we'll take it into our council plan, we'll use them for the ongoing monitoring. They're starting to realise a little bit more actually what they've done, and they're starting to push back on actually using them for the progress monitoring because I think they're going to find the gaps are going to be exposed a lot easier, and I think that's part of the problem. Actually, we want the gaps exposed so we can know what to do to deal with it, but it becomes a political sledgehammer for some of them as well. So I think monitoring and a framework on sustainable development, it could be the Sustainable Development Goals or it could be social value network, but incorporating that social and environmental value into the outcomes of the entire budget spend, I think would be a significant move for us to then, as local authorities, to decide where do we put our money properly to make the well-being of the community better, which is what our residents expect.
Yeah.
I think we can really learn from Matt as well in terms of, move fast and break things like that. Actually, it's that entrepreneurial thing really needs to come into public sector in terms of how we approach these areas. We need to test and understand if they're working without the fear of the political backlash. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do, well, you broke this. There needs to be more of that spirit of trial and error.
So to respond to that, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one methodology from startups you will all know, sort of agile. But what's interesting about agile is that it's actually about doing one thing at a time. It's about a mental focus rather than sort of a switching the whole time. So a lot of the ways in which you maximize your velocity, as they call it, is because you're really in there, really concentrating, really making as much progress as possible. And then once you know your velocity, you know how to plan ahead. How long is it going to take me? So back to a comment that came earlier on, I think, about having to make a guarantee. I'm going to fix this for you by February. Agile methodology says, no, you have to get going before you know when on earth you could finish. So I think there's something very interesting about the kind of the agile mindset and the sense of focus it needs. One of the, to come back to the sense of frameworks, but also timing. Of course, a classic framework within innovation is a bit like sort of the short, medium, and long term. And typically, what do we think is going to be disruptive innovation? What might be more evolutionary innovation? What's incremental? And for any, let's say, chief executive of a business, at any moment in time, you should be working out what your portfolio of incremental, evolutionary, and radical should be. Maybe when there isn't much threat, you're at least 80% incremental, 10 and 10 or something. But actually, if things are more kind of burning platform-like, you want to ramp up the radical and ramp down the incremental. So I'd be fascinated within all of these sort of frameworks, if you made a map of all of the sort of the innovation that's happening, how much of it is incremental, how much of it is evolutionary, and how much of it is radical. Is it the right mix for the given sense of crisis or equilibrium at the time?
I think that's such a good point, and I think when you break those things down, that they obviously might have different frameworks for delivering success and successful outcomes as well, which we've spoken a lot about today. But who in our eyes and the panel's eyes is responsible for developing those frameworks and holding people to account for the success of them? Because that is something, again, very much in what we've seen in the fast innovating tech sector. Accountability is one of the most key things. Like, somebody knows very clearly, this is my job, I'm accountable for this success metric. So who in your opinion, is responsible for driving those kind of behaviours?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with public sector. The accountability isn't quite there. The accountability is in the electorate and who they're voting into power. Whereas actually we could bring in some of these types of responsibilities into chief executives of local authority. You mentioned private sector, but chief executive of local authorities, our chief executive is in the £1 billion budget. That's 10,000 people working for him. Yeah. So these values should be, I believe, going into the public sector as well as in the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Potentially, you could link it into the portfolio holder.
Yep.
Possible. But actually, if it remains actually at procurement level, focus on outcome-based procurement. So actually, you're going beyond just that 10 widget. Actually, you're saying we will value innovation. We'll vanish social and technological and knowledge-based innovation within our thinking, and you will be rewarded. If you don't, and you don't innovate, then you just get a baseline position.
Mm-hmm. I think, though, when we talk about responsible and accountable, absolutely, accountability, by and large, sits with public sector. They absolutely should own that. But it's not for them to do alone. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the key thing. Private sector, all of those contractors want to collaborate. They want to work together. And that's why the steps in MPPS around that market engagement, if delivered in the right way, if applied correctly, as intended, will be a really great step forward. Because I think, when we talk about innovation, we talk about agility, we talk about all of these things, the private sector has been ploughing investment, money, innovation, everything into this for, a number of years. And actually, they've moved quickly and broken a lot of things, but at the same time, they've learnt an awful lot. And I think it's about how we engage with them. So, so public sector absolutely have overall accountability, but responsibility is a joint thing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an incredibly good point, and kind of draws me on to my next point as well. So throughout today's sessions and the sessions elsewhere at this summit, we've talked about a lot of change, and change in a very difficult way as well, where it's across multiple organisations, a lot of people changing behaviours. So I'm going to come back to Matt here. So, how can that change management process be done well, and what do you see, again, public versus private, of the focus on that?
Well, that's a big question. I suppose when I think about it, at the very least, you do have to start with vision. You've got to get a sense of alignment in terms of, there may be different incentives, different reasons why people are aligned, but ultimately they've all got to believe that the particular destination that we've all agreed is the right one. So I think that sense of where are we all heading, is this the right goal? You start with that.
Yeah.
But then it's really just trying to make sure that each of the constituent parts, you've got a very clear theory about why they should be involved or not. They've got to have a very clear incentive. Then after that, I suppose it's is all of these more intense processes of breaking the problem down and setting off on the journey but ultimately sometimes I wonder whether we do have enough of that clear goal setting and enough of that co-design to get everyone together saying, yes, we want to go in this direction. I'm committed.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
I think part of that, we have the clear goals, we have the clear missions, and local authorities have council plans. They write a council plan every 4 or 5 years, and that is their mission statement. But then communicating that mission statement into the different assistant directorships, for instance, never seems to happen in the way they can coherently speak to each other. So you have climate people there doing a climate plan here, but they're not talking to a procurement team here. Or you have the health team over here not looking at the impacts of climate action here to actually, with active travel, for instance. So there is some crossover, but there's not enough. And I think that communication piece is probably one of the strongest things my role as a councillor is making sure that I'm trying to put my messaging into the officers so they can at least get the mission from my perspective. Now, whether other councils are doing opposite, I don't know, but I try to impose the mission that I believe in through to the officers. And
well, that was going to be my next question. Do you think the channels and processes are there to be allowing that, or do you think at the moment it's down to the individuals to be kind of proactive in spreading some of those messages and engaging in that communication?
I think it's a really complicated landscape. You know, people are expected to be jack of all trade, master of none. You know, there's so many things that people have to have a finger in, and we need to simplify that in a way that we can engage people. I mean, definitely we've spoken about some of the issues with social and environmental around the demystification piece. People don't understand what it means for them, how it applies to their role. And if we can't break that down in the most simple terms, then we're never going to have a kind of those aha moments where somebody goes, oh, I need to speak to that person over in that department, because they don't realise there's that interconnected kind of interconnectability between them. So yeah, I think, you know, when we talk about communication in any change management programme, obviously communication has to sit central to that, but there is such a thing as communication overload. So how do we keep that really simple in a way that it kind of really pulls out those key messages, but applies it so that somebody understands what it means for them?
Yeah. Can I just add to that? Sorry, just a very quick bit about sort of innovation theory and project management is you have to have reviews as well. Are we on the way? Are we getting where we wanted to? So we've got the vision bit at the beginning, but then if you check in after X months and you go, well, where are we? How's everyone feeling? Are we there yet? You know, carry on. So I think a lot of these communication things are cyclical as well. And another thing I was really taught as we worked more and more in fuzzy spaces is there is a complete difference between what's called sort of paint by numbers, very complicated projects, but you kind of know where you're going to get to, versus the really fuzzy ones that are like a fog, where you can't even probably at the beginning define what success looks like. And so again, I think that there's so much in sort of innovation practice and theory, which almost certainly is not widely understood, that projects really move around in terms of the ability to specify what success looks like. And it's okay for some projects for them to be fuzzy, and it's not okay for other projects to be fuzzy. So again, I think many of these frameworks, my frameworks may be different from your frameworks, they can help with communication because they sort of set expectation. It's okay to be feeling like this right now. Don't worry, you're feeling quite sort of at sea. It will get better. We'll get back together in a month and we'll see how much progress we've made. So again, especially for organizations talking about change management that are very used to a sense of rigor and process and sort of certainty, innovation, some stages of the innovation practice are deeply unsettling, and therefore you have to help everyone to navigate ambiguity and uncertainty, and that's a key thing I think to tackle.
So just on that point, just a practical tip really is going back slightly and saying, okay, map your stakeholders, place them into ones with power, the ones with influence and the ones with legitimacy. That will determine how you communicate with them, what methods, you know, communication channels, and then you can actually prioritise exactly what you're hearing and seeing in terms of creating your own strategy. Because ultimately, if you've got 10,000 employees internally or 1 million people in a community, who has the loudest say? Doesn't mean the biggest number has the right information or the right guidance. So therefore, by doing that sort of segmentation, you can draw that information in, and so you always remain values driven. And if you can do that, that always should go back to your vision, and you can continue to develop.
Amazing. So we have a question through the Slido app, and just a reminder, anybody who wants to ask any of our panelists questions today, you can do so through the Slido website and go to the hashtag CP Summit 25 and select the Doddington 2 Forum Hall, and your questions will come through to us. So the first question we've got are, there are many inspiring case studies where councils have embraced innovative procurement approaches, taken risks and delivered outstanding results, yet these successes and lessons learned are not widely shared. Why do you think this happens, and how could we better foster a culture of knowledge and sharing? So Danielle, I'm going to go to you first on this one.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because it goes back to that really complicated landscape. Everybody's too busy these days. I think it's become kind of the standard go-to. How are you? Busy. Yeah. And I think sometimes we do need to slow down a little bit before we speed up, because actually, are we just kind of cycling through and missing those opportunities where we could all speed up a bit if we were sharing those practices more widely? I think there's lots of forums, aren't there, where people do come together and share, but often they happen in silos, and they're repeated. I think we were having a conversation over lunch where I said, I've had conversations even recently where people are trying to define what social value means 14 years later, but they want to define it for them. And actually, there's this broader kind of understanding of how we can bring a level of standardization that allows people to go, do you know what, that is good enough? Because actually, if we keep trying to get to perfect, all that other stuff is never going to come. Yeah. So, and I think, to be fair, I think technology is really the way forward in terms of how we start to kind of share those insights more broadly. Local authorities are coming together. Central government is sharing information, but again, it's that information overload. So it's using the tools at our fingertips, particularly technology, to be able to share that information in a relatively simplistic way that targets the right people at the right time, instead of trying to spam everybody and nobody ever getting to read or engage with the things that are meaningful for them.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and also culturally, people seeking out that information, I guess, as well, and it's something that Matt and I have spoken about. So in the tech world, it's like, you always go and reference a community forum before you try and do anything. You have things like GitHub, you have so many forums, you're constantly seeking out that information, because things have changed so quickly. So you could go and do a qualification in, some digital marketing, but it'll be out of date like that. So you have to go and reference these community forums. And, it's interesting that people are willing to share that information and kind of make that openly available, even though they know their competitors can then go and access that. So did you want to touch a bit on that as well?
Yeah, well, I think what's so interesting about what you said is there are two sides to that, right? One thing you said was that the individual seeks it out. So that's a key one, right? How do we know there is a practice here where we can be good or bad at something, and therefore, I don't want to be bad, I better go and seek out some knowledge. We used to do that a lot at the Design Council, essentially say, you probably don't realize design is a really important practice and not that easy. You'd have to sort of give people examples of bad design almost, because design is really it's about being intentional about things. So in other words, most of what we do is unintentional. We go, I'll work it out, it'll work. So there is a level of education for the individual to realize that actually there is such a thing as great, and we may each not get there naturally because it's maybe not intuitive or it's a bit complicated. So I think driving demand for knowledge is really important. And then, of course, the other thing is therefore the supply. What are the supplies? Is it a peer-to-peer thing where essentially it's a sort of a forum of leading actors that really respect one another and want to learn from one another? Or is it a sort of central entity that's gathering all of this stuff? I'm sort of a big fan of the What Works centres, and amazed when people don't know about them, and all the sort of rich knowledge that's there. And of course, there's What Works Centre for local economic growth. So I'm sure it's a mixture of sort of centralised curators maybe really sort of picking out the essence, but more than anything, it's each of us understanding there's a practice here to be learnt. And if you're not learning, you're probably not improving, and actually that really matters.
And there's one thing, there's no one person accountable, ultimately, so why would it ever happen? There's no accountability. So unless there's a 360, it doesn't get done. Is there a value of sharing? Well, actually, from a macro level, from society, there is. But individually within your role, no. And if it's only going to be procurement-led, go back to the conversation, should it be policy or procurement, is you're on to the next procurement within, a next cycle, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. You've forgotten.
Yeah.
And then it comes back to the contract management. And then we all know that contract management, there isn't enough people to do contract management. There's a shortage, so you're only ever doing the basics.
Yeah.
So there's minor problems that can be overcome, but essentially it comes back to that no single person being accountable.
I think going back to your original question, there's any examples of good collaboration, and I would go probably to the Bristol LEAP project. So the energy projects in Bristol, for instance, is fostering that collaboration now, and it is starting to bring stakeholders together to deliver the net zero commitments of Bristol. That's now looking like it's going to be replicated in North Yorkshire. So there is that standard there has fostered that work. But procurement frameworks are already a collaboration of authorities, most of them. Purchasing organisations are a group of authorities in the region, so it shouldn't be that hard to communicate across the authorities to get some of that extra learning in, particularly in commissioning.
I think also, and that's a general case, Greater Manchester, they were very specific on where they wanted community value to be delivered. And it was East Manchester. With the amount of value that the supply chain was effectively providing, they de-invested 7% of the allocated spend from East Manchester back into the pot, and who knows where after that. But they didn't have to spend that money they initially allocated because suppliers and the community were doing it. So that's probably a bit more on a macro level, to show that it can be done. But what about everything else what isn't happening?
So we've got 2 minutes left, and we've suddenly got a whole flurry of questions. So if anybody doesn't get a chance to get their question answered, please do come and talk to us afterwards, or come and see us at the Bloom stand outside. But I think I've got one time for one more. So there's a question here. CPC has measured social value in an innovation program for the first time ever, DFT rural transportation. It required a great amount of education and communication to local authorities and SMEs. Are there any other pain points when implementing social value in projects, especially innovation? I mean, with 2 minutes to go, I think that's quite a big question, but any quick thoughts on that before we close up?
I'll let you have this one.
Very simply, quality of data and legacy. That's as simple as that. If you get your quality of data right, and it's about numerical, and it's about the qualitative as well, so the sentiment, and there is a continuous change, so you can go back and reflect in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, you will have the core data. If you've got the core data, then you can do things with it. But prior to that, you may struggle.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, it just goes back to that demystification. Obviously, they've said it took a lot of education and engagement. You need to get your foundations right first. Get your foundations right. Know that that's going to take you a little bit of time. But, it goes back to keeping it simple as well. I think people sometimes like to overcomplicate what they do. It gives us all a bit of status and ego, doesn't it, when we think we're very important. But actually, the more we can simplify it, the better the engagement will be, the higher the adoption.
Yeah.
Amazing. I think that's a great point to close on today. So we have run out of time, but as I said, if anybody wants to come and speak to any of the panelists afterwards, they'll be around, and also we'll be at our stand, the Bloom stand as well, outside by the food, so added bonus there as well. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you very much, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you.
Thank you.